Qualifying for the Japanese Grand Prix is over and the fastest driver of the day was Max Verstappen, and predictably Red Bull are looking very strong. But what did we learn? Well, today I'm going to be doing a data analysis from qualifying. If you enjoyed the video, then please hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. Now, let's get straight into the video. As usual, I'm going to be talking about the top 5 teams later on, which are Aston Martin, Mercedes, McLaren, Ferrari and Red Bull later on, so stick around for that. Yep, qualifying is over and it was a dominant performance by Red Bull. Going into this weekend, it was somewhat expected, especially after last year and what we saw from them at high-speed corners at circuits such as Melbourne and Jeddah. But it has to be said, McLaren gave them a tough run. One thing with Suzuka is that circuit evolution is not as large as what we see at other circuits, and you would expect that as the Suzuka circuit is used a lot for racing. Because of that, the lap times did not improve by as much as they would do at other circuits, and you can see that here. Lap times only improved by 0.7 seconds for Max Verstappen from the start of Q1 to the end of Q3. Let's now compare those two laps to see where the lap had at least improved for Verstappen in the final run versus his very first run. And when you look at these laps, you can see that they are actually very similar, indicating that grip had not really improved by a large amount over the session. Through the S's, you can see that really the only thing that changes is that about halfway through the S's, Verstappen is ever so slightly more confident and he gets to the throttle a little bit sooner. And then through Dunlop, he has the grip to go full throttle sooner and carries that all the way through the Degnas. The final main point where he has a somewhat clear advantage is here. This section is the last part of Spoon. In this, Verstappen is much more committed, and this extra commitment means that he carries that advantage not just through the last part of Spoon, but all the way down the straights and through 130R and then through that final straight before he hits the brakes for the Casio Triangle chicane. Verstappen has been hooked up all weekend, and this circuit is perfect for Red Bull, and they have been rewarded with their first front row lockout of the season. When it comes to top speeds then, what teams were looking good and what teams were not looking so good? Well, to find out, I've brought up the top speeds from all the teams. To find out how we get their top speeds, we take the fastest laps from each team and we take the top speed that they reach on those fastest laps. And what can we learn when we look at these fastest laps? Well, what we learn is that actually, as usual, Haas are very fast in a straight line, and I think the reason for that is because Haas are lacking downforce when compared to their rivals. One thing that is a slight change from what we usually see is Aston Martin are looking a lot stronger in a straight line as well, as they are just behind the Haas car. Red Bull, who are typically the fastest cars in a straight line along with Haas, are a little bit down on their rivals, and not only that, they are a lot slower than they were last year. Last year they were hitting over 330 kilometers per hour, but this year they're only hitting 324 kilometers per hour. This tells me that Red Bull are running with a lot more downforce than they did last year, which might explain why their times are also faster than they were last year. Speaking of Haas, for me, they are the team in the midfield that could be struggling a little bit this weekend when it gets to the race. They are very fast in a straight line, but they are clearly lacking some downforce. And you can see that when you compare the Q2 lap times of Nico Hülkenberg to Yuki Tsunoda. These two teams are main rivals right now, as they are the only midfield teams to have actually scored any points, and let's be honest, they're the only midfield teams that look like they could score points at this point in the season. And when you compare their two laps, you can see where the differences are between Haas and RB. Through the S-bend, you can see how Haas immediately loses time, and also through Spoon Curve. They do make up for it down the straights, but they are lacking downforce, and in my opinion, in the race tomorrow, that lack of downforce is going to hit them hard when racing in the pack. They're going to find it difficult to stick with their rivals and make use of that straight line speed that they have. Haas might not be looking so good in race trim, but one midfield team that is looking very good is their main rivals, RB, as Yuki Tsunoda nailed a lap to get into Q3 and teammate Daniel Ricciardo qualified in 11th place. and he only just missed out on a trip into Q3. Let's now compare the lap times of Tsunoda to Ricciardo from Q2 to see where Daniel lost out by a very fine margin. And when you look at these two laps, you can see that there is very little to tell between them, and it is clear that they are extracting everything from the RB. Through the S's, it looks like Tsunoda is ever so slightly faster than Ricciardo, and then going into Dunlop, Ricciardo gains that time back, and he actually gets ahead of Tsunoda, but it is by a very, very small margin. But that didn't last, and Tsunoda just edges out Ricciardo. Both RBs are lining up 10th and 11th, and for me, this is the perfect opportunity for them to score 1 point, maybe even 3 points if they can get both cars into the top 10, and they can extend that edge over Haas. Daniel Ricciardo just needs to keep doing what he's doing, and if he can do this, then for me, there's no reason why RB would even consider looking at Liam Lawson to replace him. I just want to say that if you're enjoying the video so far, then I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. Now though, let's get back to the video and let's talk about the top 5 teams, starting with Aston Martin. For Aston Martin, today was a tale of two halves, as Alonso dragged absolutely everything out of the car to qualify in 5th place, whereas his teammate Lance Stroll was eliminated in Q1 as he qualified down in 16th place. But how did Lance lose out so badly? Well, I'm going to compare his Q1 lap to Alonso's Q1 lap as well to see where the differences were. Looking at this lap, the majority of the time was made up in the very first sector, as Alonso was able to fly through the S's and also through Dunlop, whereas Stroll seemed to be really struggling. This for me is very much a confidence thing. They have the same car, but yet there is 8 tenths between them, and the majority of that is in Sector 1, which is all high speed and all about commitment. Suzuka has never been a strong circuit for Stroll, but this doesn't help his cause at all. Going through Turn 1 as well, which is pretty much flat in modern day F1 cars, you can see Stroll is actually backing off more than Alonso, and so he misses out on some extra speed and some all-important time. In the race tomorrow for Lance, it will all be about recovery and trying to get past the mighty fast Haas cars with only one DRS zone. For teammate Alonso, I anticipate that he might struggle to finish where he qualified, as the Aston does lack a little bit of race pace, but he will have the ability to fight the Mercedes and Charles Leclerc, who is behind him, and he could still beat 1 or 2 of those 3 cars. For Mercedes, today was very much a sign of improvement from them. They brought some upgrades, and at a high-speed, high-downforce circuit, they have not fallen away like I would have expected they would have, given what we saw of course in Jeddah and also Melbourne. And Lewis Hamilton, for the first time this season, out-qualified teammate George Russell. Even so, there is still 6 tenths for them to find in order to fight the 2 Red Bull cars. And now, let's have a look at Hamilton's lap and compare it to Verstappen, because when you look at these laps, you will see Hamilton doesn't lose a time where you would have expected it. Going into the weekend, if you said where will Mercedes lose a time, I would have said it all would be in Sector 1, but that is not the case. Minus the entry into the S's, they're actually very similar in pace, and Hamilton only really loses about 1 or 2 tenths, which is much better than we would have seen at other races. Instead, the time is lost on the exit of the very tight hairpin, and you can see that he just can't get the traction out of the corner, and then we see the same thing through Spoon. This potentially tells me that Hamilton might have been struggling with the tyres as the lap continued, and the temperatures might have just gotten away from Lewis a little bit. In the race tomorrow, it will be interesting to see if they can stick with the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc and maybe even beat him. For McLaren, it was a fantastic qualifying session as Lando Norris is lining up in 3rd place on the grid as he had a fantastic lap and almost got amongst the Red Bulls. Let's compare his lap now to that of Verstappen, and when you look at these laps you see something pretty exciting for me. McLaren are actually faster in the high-speed S section. This shows me that McLaren have incredible downforce at high speed. They've not really brought any upgrades, but they still have the pace there. Unfortunately for McLaren though, Suzuka also features some very slow corners like the tight hairpin, and this is where it starts to come undone. They don't have the mechanical grip in the McLaren, and that seems to be where they lose out, because on the exit of Spoon, once again, they match the mighty Red Bulls, and they actually are able to ever so slightly close the gap. In the race tomorrow, McLaren are in a great position to score another podium, but they are going to face stiff competition from Carlos Sainz behind, who is really in the form of his life. For Ferrari, it was a very difficult day for Charles Leclerc, as he had to do an extra run in Q1, which meant that he could only do one run at the end of Q3 instead of 2 runs, and that potentially could be why he is starting a little bit further back. He has not had the confidence all weekend compared to teammate Carlos Sainz, so let's compare their laps. And when you look at these 2 laps, a lot of the damage is done at the beginning of the lap. Leclerc just doesn't have the confidence in the car, and you can see that similar to Stroll, he's not as fast into the first corner as well. Also, as the sector continues, he cannot carry the speed of Carlos Sainz. As we get to the tighter and more technical corners though, Leclerc does gain back some of the time, and we saw that multiple times as Charles Leclerc was the fastest in the middle sector, but he just couldn't put it together. And finally, he was a little sloppy in the last corner and lost out. He does nearly beat Carlos Sainz, but instead he was a 10th behind, and that 1/10 has cost him several places on the grid for tomorrow. In the race, Ferrari will be looking once again to Carlos Sainz in order to get themselves on the podium, and Charles Leclerc will be looking to recover and make his way through the field and get a top 5 finish. I think if Ferrari have stronger race pace, then that should be possible. And finally for Red Bull, they secured their first front row lockout of the season, as Sergio Perez almost beats Max Verstappen to pole position. Let's now compare their 2 laps, and when you look at them, you can see that there are minor differences between them, but it is those differences that actually bring them together. Through the first sector, Verstappen ever so slightly has the edge, and for Max, his advantage peaks at that tight hairpin. But after the hairpin, Sergio starts to really come into his own, and he claws back some of that time, and he's almost able to take pole position, but that is until they reach the Casio Triangle chicane, where Verstappen gets that edge back once again. Going into the race, it should be a fairly easy Red Bull 1-2, and I don't expect Perez to fight Verstappen too much at the start of the race. So with that in mind then, what are my predictions for the Japanese Grand Prix? Well, I think the top midfield driver and midfield team will be Yuki Tsunoda in the RB, as RB seem to have moved themselves ever so slightly away from the rest of the midfield. But what about the top 5 in the race? Well, I think in P5 it will be Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari, P4 will be Lando Norris in the McLaren, P3 will be Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari, P2 will be Sergio Perez in the Red Bull, and yes, I do think Max Verstappen will get back to winning ways, and he will win and probably dominate the Japanese Grand Prix. But those are my thoughts. The question is, what do you guys think will happen? In the comment section down below, let me know. And as always, comment, leave a like, and subscribe for more F1 content. Thank you all so much for watching.